Hi everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever your time zone may be. Thank you so much for joining us today for a fantastic webinar presented by Reed Havens of Havens Consulting. Today, Reed is going to walk us through the two cornerstones of building optimized and low maintenance queries in Power BI. So, Reed, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the introductions, Kelly. So yeah, everybody welcome, regardless of where you're tuning in. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join this awesome webinar to talk about a few different things related to Power Query. So as Kelly mentioned, the primary focus of this next 45 minutes or so is going to be on performance optimization, and if time permitting, some error handling in Power Query, and kind of ways to help supercharge and bring that stuff up to speed. And actually, one thing I just want to go ahead and do while I'm presenting, let me turn on my webcam. I think you'll be able to see both that way. There we go. That way you can at least see my face. All right, and yeah, let me give a little bit of background about me too. So I've been in this industry for about 7 years now. I'm doing analytics and business intelligence, and running my own business for about the last 5. I am actually very happy to say, for the first time, like besides the tweets last week, is I've been now renewed for my MVP for the 3rd year running. So very happy to have that once again this year. And I do a lot of stuff, especially with Power BI, primarily focusing on aesthetics and visualization. That's kind of a niche market that I found that often kind of falls short on a lot of reports, where you might have really good data, but not necessarily presented in a way that tells a good story or anything else. So that's kind of where my specialty lies, just to give a little summarization on that. And I also do a lot of training and teaching, actually sometimes locally at the local university as well. But in general, just Power BI is certainly where my expertise falls in. And today's topic is going to be a subsection of Power BI, which is Power Query. So overall, the kind of the flow that we're going to be, again, for the next 45 minutes or so going over is these primary modules. So reducing query data, optimizing query performance, leveraging query folding. Those are the ones that will more than likely hit in the next 45. And then, like I said, depending on pacing and timing, potentially handling conversion errors. With most of my presentations, I have the ability to kind of flex them out and in, depending on how much time I have to actually present them. But let's just go ahead and get started. Talking about reduction and reducing of query data as you import it into your file. Very important conversations, especially for performance and optimization when your model is running in Power BI Desktop and in the Power BI service. Very common transformations, really, think about it kind of as reducing the width and the height. Column modification, so getting rid of unnecessary columns or transforming those columns as necessary, and then reducing rows, either through grouping or filtering, and we'll talk about some of these. But in general, you want that footprint that you have for your query, which turns into a table, to be as small as possible to fit your business requirements. Column modification very typically will be accessed via the ribbons there at the top. Most of your common transformations in Power Query are accessible up there, or commands, as you might call them. And a lot of what is great about Power Query, is those of you familiar with it, is that it is all user interface driven. So very little coding is needed for 99% of the transformations that you do. You can also modify the columns. So not only can you make a selection of which columns you want, you can also then transform them to further optimize them, reduce the size of the data, or just make sure that they fit and are categorized in a way that fits those business requirements of yours. Lots of options to do this as well. We also have row reductions. And by the way, each of these will have demonstrations that I'll be going through at the end of this module. And then just to make sure that there's a adequate time to ask questions, what I will say is, as questions come up naturally as I'm going through this stuff, please make sure to type those into the chat window. And then during the question period after each module, I'll have the moderators read that back to me, and then that way I can answer those questions during that time. So there will be definitely time for questions as well. But as far as filtering rows, very commonly, the most typical way that you'd filter historically in Excel and now in Power BI and Power Query is by category or date. So selecting the items from a list that you want or don't want, also being able to filter out dates if there are data types. The types of filters that you have as well is also dependent on the data type. So numerical has greater than or less than. Dates, before and after. Text will have contains, does not contain. So there are lots of different dynamic ways to filter your data depending on the data type of that column itself. Removing empty rows is another great way to do query reduction. Depending on how you shape your data, you might end up with a bunch of rows that has 0 values or blanks, and you don't necessarily need those. So that's another really good way to get rid of those unnecessary rows that doesn't serve any business requirement. Duplicates as well, very commonly, especially if you're sculpting and creating a relational data model and you're trying to create dimension and fact tables, you will often want to get rid of duplicates. So that's another way to get rid of that extra rows that are in your table. Error removal as well, again, depending if we have time at the end for error handling conversations, but that's another way to get rid of kind of dirty data that you're importing, especially if it's from like a flat file source where people are kind of fat fingering the data in sometimes, and maybe there's some errors in there. Hopefully you don't have too many errors that you're encountering from a database, but flat files pretty commonly, in manually entered Excel documents will have some errors that sometimes have to be accounted for, and there are certainly intelligent ways to accommodate that. One other way as well, besides actually filtering out rows, is you're not actually getting rid of any data as much as you are summarizing it up to a higher level. Great example would be if our entire report only goes down to the product name level. We don't care about order at the order level. So individual unique order IDs, you could maybe sum that up to then calculations done at the product name or product subcategory level. So you are reducing rows, but you're basically just summing up the data or grouping it up to a level that meets the lowest granularity needed for the business requirements of that specific report. All right, and with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a demonstration. We're going to kind of have a quick recap at the end and then also go into questions. So let's talk a lot about what we just went over. So what I have in front of us is a standard query, and we're going to go through a lot of examples of the filtering and column modifications and row filters as well, so we can see some good examples of all of this. So just initially kind of scanning through the data, and some of this I'll breeze through a bit, but I will make sure to hit on all the concepts appropriately. So taking a look here, like we have it as an example, a column that's called date key. That is something that can be sometimes used in Excel. Even databases will sometimes have keys, but very commonly in Power BI, your date key should usually be an actual date data type. So we could convert this if we wanted to, but if I scan through the rest of my data, I can also see that I have a date time column. So this is in a situation where I don't actually need all of these columns. I can get rid of date key. Now I could just go ahead and right click and say remove, and that will essentially just get rid of this column only. But there's another practice that I like to do and I prefer, which is a little bit better as a general cleanup. So I actually would prefer to use choose columns, and because what that does is that creates a nice framework around the data that around the columns that you want and prevents any unnecessary columns from coming in. So you'll observe this in a second. But the very first thing that I want you to do is anytime you're using Power Query is I want you to go over to the View tab, make sure your formula bar is turned on, so that's going to have all the information up here at the top. So this is the M code that's showing up in Power Query. And again, you don't normally have to touch it. It's something that's generated for you anytime you click a transform button, but it at least shows you kind of the source code of what's happening behind the curtains, which can certainly be informative as you kind of learn a bit more about Power Query. And I would also just recommend turning on the quality, profile, and distribution. That just helps to give you some histograms and metadata about the data itself, just as an FYI. So I'm going to choose columns, and I want you to observe the code as I do this. Yep. And in here, I'm just going to get rid of date key. That is a column that I do not need in this table. So I've done that. I'm going to hit OK. Now notice what it actually did is I removed that column. However, the command that it's running and the formula in here is actually selecting the columns with the name sales key, channel key, etc. So this applied step means that now if any other columns ever show up in this table in the future, they're not going to automatically show up into my model on the next import. I have to come in as a developer and make sure that they get added if they are meeting a business requirement. So it helps to prevent kind of unnecessary junk data from coming in the future. So in this case, it's a good way to kind of put your columns under lock and key. It's also a practice I would even recommend to do. Use the remove column step, select all of your columns. Even though it's not removing anything, it is preventing new columns from coming in the future. So it's a nice little like safety net around your selection process. All right, that's going to be step one. And now we can also do a step two and go ahead and basically change all the data types. Because this is a flat source that I'm using just for the demo, you'll notice that ABC123, besides a catchy Michael Jackson song, that indicates that these are all set to like a generic data type. when you import them, very often they will get imported as text. So we want to convert all of these. Now, I don't want to have to go through and set them all manually. So one thing you can do is Control A, select all of your columns, come up to transform, and you can use the detect data type button. And that will automatically, based on the first 1,000 rows, detect what data type it thinks they should be. So like that there. And it'll spool up for a second. There we go. Now you can see all of the data types up here have been changed. For the most part, they're working pretty well. If we keep going over. There we go. Yep, date time is now set to an actual date time here, sales event, etc. So now we're starting to get the data that will actually work in the model. We do have a date time thing set in here, which is important, but we can still continuously clean this up. Another thing to mention as far as compression and storage size in the model is it's less important of the number of rows that you have. It's more important about the cardinality of the columns for all of those rows. So given in a good example, geography key. You can see the distribution here. There's not a ton. There's only 193 distinct values in here, and then 30 unique. So there's not a ton of unique values versus, say, some of these other columns. So even if I had 45 million rows on this table, this column isn't going to take up that much room because there's some compression happening in the back end, and it's really storing the unique IDs and then locations through some really cool algorithm methods that it has for the Vertipack engine in Power BI. So what we want to do whenever we can is reducing granularity or reducing the cardinality of a column. So in this case, let's take a look at some of the columns that we have and maybe some places where we don't need, we can kind of roll up the data to a higher granularity. One example is the sales amount column. So this is set to decimal, and as you can see, a lot of these decimal places go past 5 decimals out. And for currencies, we typically don't need decimals nearly this far out. So a couple of methods. We could apply a round function and automatically have this get converted to the nearest cents. Very often, though, in finance and banking, they want it out to the nearest 5th decimal. So that's going to be an easy fix for us. I'm going to come up here, and instead of decimal number, I'm going to change it to fixed decimal, which cuts it off a little bit further in. So it will now reduce the number of unique values, which means that column is now going to be smaller. It's going to ask me, do I want to add a new step or replace? In general, I don't want 2, 3, or 4 change steps. I just want 1. So I'm going to replace the current step. And it'll take a second. There we go. And this actually now rounded it to the nearest 2. So we now have all the data cleaned up. The cents are calculated appropriately, and we have significantly less unique values in here. Especially if we're dealing with, let's say, 45 million rows, you're eventually going to end up with repeating values somewhere, which will just be compressed better. Another really good example of this is date time. This is probably the most common thing that I see that blows up a model because the number of unique dates and times is massive. There's, especially if you go all the way down to like the actual seconds, then you can end up with easily millions and millions of unique values across your data sets. And most of the time, the things that I would recommend is either split this up into a date and a time column. Those will both have now less unique values and can be compressed better. The other option is very typically just roll it up to date. Easily 80–90% of the reports that I build do not need time in there anywhere. They just need the date, or in this case, the day that the event happened. So I can right click, select transform, date only. And this is important to do. If I actually just try to come up here, let me show you. If I just try to change this to date, it's going to throw me an error message. It actually needs to be extracted. So let me replace current, show you what happens if I just try to format it as date. Run. There you go. See, it's returning an error message. So it has to first be set as date time, and then what you do is you extract the date from it, because it can't basically convert a date time field to date initially. It has to be a 2-step process. So there we go. It's set to date time and important. So if you ever see that error message, right click and then say transform date only. So that adds a second step, which extracts the date from it. There we go, extracted date. And now As soon as that finishes loading, there we go. Now we get the date. So, it's one of those things that kind of caught me up the first few times I was using Power Query, but as you can see, easy to do. Just as an FYI, it will need to be 2 parts to get this, or of course splitting that column. So there we go. We've done 2 methods where we've now reduced the granularity on 2 columns. That will same number of rows, but it will now require less space to store because the cardinality, aka the number of unique values, is smaller. Last thing you want to actually check over here. So if you take a look at the sales key, another really common scenario that I see for this. So this sales key is unique per row in this table specifically. And anytime you have an ID that is unique per row, the business question then needs to be asked, do I need to display this key or this ID anywhere in the report? Or do I just need to do a count of something? So in this case, I don't need to import my sales key. What I would want to do is I can remove this and I can do a count rows. I had a project a year ago where the client's model was about 1.8 gigabytes in size. They had a 45 million row table, and they had a sales key column in there that had 45 million unique values. And I asked them, well, what is this used for? Or we're doing a count of this column. So do you actually need to display this value anywhere in your report? Well, no, we just need to know a count of orders. Well, each row is an order. So if you count rows, that is an order. I went in, deleted the column from the model, changed the measure, and refreshed it. It went from 1.8 gigabytes down to about 600 megabytes. It immediately cut more than 50% of the size off of model, over a gigabyte, instantaneously. So really make sure with keys and IDs, are they needed for a join? Are they needed to be displayed? And especially when they're unique per row, that's a count rows. You should never have to count the values because they're already unique per row, and they will already roll up when you do row counts to any other category, like in this case, channel, store, etc. So those are those 2 things that I would encourage you to take away with is make sure that you don't have any unnecessary IDs, and that date time should either be split to date and time columns, or it needs to be set just as a date only field. Both will save you a ton of space. So now in this case, I'm just going to come back to my remove column step, select the gear icon, get rid of sales key. All right. And there we go. Even on a basic table like this, you can see that I've done quite a few different transformations, all in the process of wanting to get the footprint and the size of this as small as possible. And you can see in here that there's one little thing where, because sales key used to be part of the change type step, you can actually even say column sales key is not found, go to error. This is just a little FYI. This button here is super helpful. It's showing me that the change type step has an issue. So here's one spot where you can do a tiny bit of M code editing. Sales key is listed in here. So if I just simply get rid of that, let that refresh one more time. All right, and now it's loaded. So we have our basically cleaned up, optimized table. And the last thing that I'll mention in this section here, it's kind of another good little FYI, is taking a look at the data that we have. If we broke down our data into 3 primary types, there are a few other data types, of course, but text, date, and numbers or integers. Between those 3, integer is going to be the smallest, date is the second smallest, text is certainly the largest. Now, an example here of where we could potentially do a conversion, in theory, if you really wanted to optimize, just in concept, like looking at product key, all of these product keys is really essentially a number with the word PD for product in front of it. So honestly, I could remove the PD, and I could instead have, instead of having this as a text field, I could have this as a numerical field if I wanted to. In general, I would just leave it as is. It's not going to take up a ton of extra room, but this is just a good practice to think about, or even when designing a database sometimes. Text fields should be avoided unless absolutely necessary for higher amount unique cardinality keys like hexadecimal or anything. So easy enough to go ahead and update this. I'm going to go to the step before my change type step up here, and I'm going to right click on product key, replace values. Now replace values can also be thought about as a remove values depending on how you format it. Just double checking, do I want to insert a step in between mine? And I absolutely do. There we go. I define PD and replace with, leave it blank. That will now remove the letters P and D. Takes a second. There we go. And now I can update my changed type step. I no longer want it to be text. I would like it to be whole number. And replace current. All right, done. So what we can do now is go ahead and kind of quickly summarize, and then I will go on to the next section. So kind of as a quick recap. Things to be aware of and things that are important to do. Making sure to select your columns, basically only the columns that you need for the business requirements. Easy enough to edit that remove column step, add more in later. But lock in what you need today, not what you're going to need tomorrow, unless it's an immediate need that's going to come very soon. Filtering rows either by date and history. Something I didn't do, but it's a fairly just straightforward thing of filtering your date column. You don't need to import 20 years of data very commonly. You might only need the last 2 or 3, but just making sure that you filter in some way to either the categories or the date field to constrain it to whatever range that you need for that. And then reducing granularity. We've talked about how to do that with the date columns as well as the dollar values as well. Those are reducing the granularity of those two. That way it's going to have less unique values and it's going to compress better. And then as necessary, changing those data types. If we have a scenario like the product key where we have something that's text that can be converted to number, there's a potential to do that. I would say save that to the very end if you absolutely need to squeeze out every drop of file storage possible. Very commonly, that won't be absolutely necessary, but it's just good to know that that is an option for optimization.
Okay.
And then, yep, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead. You've got your references, I apologize.
Yeah, no, and I'll just say is that don't worry about writing these down. The PDF will be available as a link in the description on the video. I'll just make sure to have this hosted on my site, so you'll be able to download this. But each module will come with a nice series of doc links for various additional resources. This is also the time now where I'll have some questions, so go ahead if there is any on the forum that I can answer.
We have a few actually. So Liam asked, how do you get that valid error empty? That's super handy. And then somebody, I think, responded, anonymous, saying you can see those under the column profile and distribution checkboxes under the view ribbon. I just wanted to verify that that was the correct answer. And if so, then I believe Liam's question is answered.
Yeah, the column profiler is just turned on under the view tab, and it gives you essentially like the histogram of that. It's right next to where the formula bar is turned on, and any of the words like column profiler, column statistics, etc. I keep those on. Plus, it also helps to show if there's error messages.
Awesome. And Bo asks, what are the pros and cons of doing this data trimming in Power Query in the data model rather than doing it with SQL when pulling data into the Power Query?
I wouldn't say there's a pro or con for either. It depends on where you're comfortable. If you do not have access to the database, of course, at that point, then you do need to do it in Power Query. But if you are a DBA admin or you have rights to do views or scripts or anything else, and you can do them in SQL, and you're better at writing SQL, you're welcome to use it there. The biggest difference to me that I like to do and learn in Power Query versus that is Power Query can do these transformations against any data source. It could be SharePoint, it could be Salesforce, Azure, Google. Once you get comfortable with Power Query, you basically have a universal transform set against any of them. Where if you do all of your stuff in SQL, at some point, then comes the day where you need to do some transformations on a new data source that isn't SQL. Well, no, I can't write my SQL code against this new source, and I have to use Power Query now. So it depends on I'll give the consultant answer of it depends. But very commonly, I will sometimes do a bit of dabbling in SQL. If all the data is kept in there, I will write some views. That will still perform well, but Power Query also, which we'll discuss, has query folding. So it can also basically write the SQL views for you and pass it back to the source in some situations as well. So, really just go by what you're most comfortable with and where your expertise lies. But Power Query has a more universal application of a lot more data sources to do those transformations if you start getting good with doing it directly in Power BI.
Excellent. And Bo also asks, to reduce cardinality, how much denormalizing your data do you recommend when pulling it in?
I heard probably, so it's and when it comes to cardinality, how much do I normalize my data when I'm pulling it in?
Yeah.
It's a broad question. I mean, I try to normalize as much as I can. The biggest ones that you saw as a takeaway, I get rid of any ID columns that I don't need, especially row IDs. Those things are a killer of file size. And then if you could take those, take away that one, and then making sure that you split or remove the time dimension from date time. Those will massively help to normalize your data. Other than that, I try to do as little touching of the data as possible. Only things that are absolutely necessary. And then those emergency things that I save for last are the converting the columns from text to numbers as necessary. So you want to do as little as possible. Same thing with importing your data, as few rows as possible, transformations, as few of them as possible.
Okay. We've got a few more questions here. Is there any way to do these types of transformations automatically instead of having to do it manually for each data set? And thank you, Anonymous, by the way, for responding to Liam earlier, whoever that was.
Yeah, in theory, if you have the same table in a few locations, there's an automated, you can duplicate the query and switch the source. But for the most part, the initial setup is always going to be you doing it. It's it's a one-time setup, which doesn't take that much time comparatively. And then every time you refresh the file, if you're refreshing it 8 times a day, it's reapplying your transformations each time. So, there are some ways to reuse logic, but for the most part, every table is unique enough that the column names are going to be different, or the exact type of transformation you will do might be a little bit different. So it really is a case-by-case basis for the most part. There's not really any kind of template other than the idea that I've already bestowed upon you, which is regardless of the tables, the date time reduction or the row ID reduction. Those are the templates that I'm passing on, or these are the best practices to do against any table rather than the actual button to click each time.
Awesome, awesome. And then we have another question. Well, we have a comment from Danny D, who said, if you really want to optimize the PQ window, turn off the column quality profiler. And then also we have, what are the rules for choosing between import versus direct query versus mixed model?
I'll answer the direct query one at the very end. In general, 95%, for most people, the majority of your reports should be import. It has the most customization, the most features. People often switch to direct query or composite. Basically, you're either all or some of your tables are getting live feeds from your database. But pretty commonly, when people say they want live data, I'm like, all right, well, what does that mean? Well, normally every day at 8 a.m. and then at 2 p.m., I have a meeting and I want current data. Okay, so you could just set a scheduled refresh for 7:30 and then 1:30 p.m. Each day. And well, yeah, would that give you current data? Well, yeah. So you don't need a direct query model. All you need is just to have refreshes that are timed so that you have current data whenever you're consuming it. Granted, there are some situations where throughout the day you just constantly want live feeds every 15 minutes. That's too many scheduled refreshes to happen. But that is a very small minority of people who I see use direct query versus when you actually need it. Import will solve your problems most of the time and get you the data almost as much as you need. Like Power BI Pro is, and you can check me on this, Kelly. It's 8x a day refreshes, and then what is it for premium?
For premium, well, it depends. Let me just look it up. I think we just had a change. It depends.
Yeah, it's a lot more for premium. Yeah.
It's a lot more. I'll get you the exact number shortly.
Yeah, I think it's roughly more than I'm pretty sure it's more than 1 an hour, essentially, if you really, really needed it. But, again, import will solve most of your needs. So I think the takeaway from that is only use direct query if you absolutely have to, but it comes with its own can of worms of complexities and gateways that are required potentially. And it also puts a strain on your server. Depending on how you configure it, if you have 100 people using a report and constantly getting data, it's going to be pinging your database a lot to constantly get new data feeds versus just the imported model being hosted in the Azure node that's in Power BI, the Power BI service.
Exactly. And then we have another question. Shouldn't we do a lookup in the product table to get a good product ID instead of then replacing TRIC?
Depends on if the database has that for you or not. Sometimes the database, in a perfect scenario, if I was using like AdventureWorks, sure, there's going to be like perfect tables that have the good data you get. But unfortunately, most of the databases and the data locations in the real world, it's going to have bad data or non-optimized data that you're going to have to clean up. So yes, in an ideal world, you could just do a join, bring in the right column, and do that. Totally fine. But sometimes you just don't have that option. I'll short circuit the remaining questions for the end, just so I can get to the next section, because I do want to cover a few of the things. So I'll go ahead and do that for now.
No worries.
Next thing I want to talk about is query performance optimization. This is going to be just going into a straight demo. So I'll go ahead and hop over to that. And actually, just to save on a bit memory, even when Power BI is not actually using anything, it still manages to just idly chew up about 1 GB of RAM per instance, which is always fun. There we go. This will be a little faster now. All right, let's talk about a few other things that are in here. Few sections that I want to discuss as far as like subtopics under optimization. Duplicate steps. So this is something I very commonly see as a pitfall with people, where what you have is something that looks like this. You have change type, rename column 1, rename column 2, 3, 4, 5, and you basically people just like shotgun approach it, which you still get the table that you want. It's still cleaned up, and it's still exporting, and it looks good as the final product. But now you have a lot more steps to troubleshoot if something breaks. And you know, the performance may or may not be a little faster or slower depending on what order things are going in, but it's now potentially doing more work in the back end depending on the order of these. So in general, you want as few steps as possible to get to your end goal. And sometimes you don't know that until you've done all of them, but there are ways to consolidate. So this rename column, here, maybe you come back to this previous step and you rename the column on this step instead. Go ahead and type in the correct name and you can delete the other one. But the end result would be something after I do this cleanup, because I don't want to go through every single step manually, as opposed to just talking about the general concept. But you should have something that looks more like this. You have 1 renamed column step, 1 change type step. There are exceptions to the rule. Sometimes you need to do a change type to do a transformation of something else, and then you still need to do other change types down the road. But pretty commonly, those should be the things typically left for the end of all of your query steps. So at the very end of this list, you should have a change type and rename columns. And there should normally be just one of each of those. Same thing with like removing other columns. You shouldn't have deleted column, removed other columns, choose columns. You shouldn't have a bunch of these. You should have one step that basically, encapsulates all of them at the very end of your query process. So these 4 steps here did the exact same transformations as all of the ones over here. So it's, this isn't wrong. It's just less optimized. It's still getting the result that you want, but with a lot of extra steps. And this is probably one of the most common things that I do as a step 1 when somebody just gives me a report and say, fix it and make it better. I will go through and I will usually scrub 30 to 40% of their steps out and consolidate them together. So very common pitfall that I see, and a common recommendation is consolidate as much as you can with these types of steps. Another thing that I want to mention as well, let that load over here. So one thing that's actually good for performance, especially if it's having to import this data. So from certain sources like SQL, we'll talk about in a minute, there's something called query folding that happens, but very common against a lot of sources. What it has to do is it connects to the source, it downloads all of that data into memory, and then it transforms it. So if I'm doing a ton of transformations like this, and then at the very, very end, I put a filter for say last 12 months, that means that if this had 30 years of data, to do any of these other transformations, it's having to import so much more data to look through and scan and group by as far as that date range. And then at the very end, it finally filters it out. So that will mean that your transformations can potentially be significantly slower. So very commonly, one of the first things you should do is think of it as FF, filters first. That should be one of the absolute very first steps that you do in any query process. Doesn't really matter what these steps are. It's just the fact that my filter is at the very end. It instead should be somewhere close to the beginning. In this case, actually, after I created my date column, which was a transformation I needed to do. That's the very immediate next step that I did. On top of that is I immediately filtered, and you'll also see that the other step that I moved towards the beginning is removing unused columns. This is actually an important note that if you're not familiar with him, Chris Webb, he has a great blog that Webb with 2 B's. He talks about some scenarios against, especially against like flat file data sources, where if you start to do transformations with extra columns, that is actually extra data it has to bring in. It's not more rows, but it will actually make transformations slower because it still has to bring in the unique values for all of these other columns. So getting rid of unnecessary columns first can also speed up your transformations against certain data sources too. So I would recommend, if you have two things to think of shifting for column and row removal, put them as close to the beginning of your process as possible. Then all the transformation should come after that. And that will, again, just basically speed up the refresh time whenever you're processing this information. And I'll go to this one just for sake of time. I'm going to skip through the remove duplicates. But there's a really important one that I'm actually, I'm happy to have learned from another kind of Power Query guru, Ken Pulse. He also does a lot of stuff with Power Query, located just a bit north of me up in Vancouver. But a few years ago, I was asking him for like some general advice on adding columns in performance. And overall, what you can do, and again, just think of this as an example, less about the actual data itself. But if you're going to add a column into a table, regardless of what the column is, you do have that option for conditional columns up here. It's like a nested if statement that you can write. You can click this, say if this then that, basically use the interface to create, and I approximately did that here. The thing opens up. Come on. There we go. So basically just I'm doing an if then, replacing, creating a new grouped column using this thing. However, though, the conditional column can be very slow. It does iterate row by row, and that can have a major performance impact. So if you ever have the option of having this data somewhere else in a join, whether or not it is a local table where you've done enter data, or you just brought it in from the database, the thing that will be significantly faster is instead having a table with that key and then doing a left join to bring in that column. That will be significantly faster for performance, and it will basically iterate and allow the data to come in using a join function essentially in the back end versus having to do the iteration of row by row, check conditions, return a result. So I'm just using channel name it as an example. In an actual model scenario, I would probably have a channel dimension table and a sales fact table, but this just shows you the concept of conditional column will be slower, and joins to add that column, if you have to have it in the table, will run faster than that. So this is kind of like a pro tip for you that I wanted to pass along when it comes to that. Yeah, and like I said, there's a couple other things that I wanted to mention, but for sake of time and brevity, I want to go ahead and switch over to, I'll answer 1 or 2 questions, and I want to switch over to query folding as kind of the final thing in here. Okay. And again, my slides will all be available. So let me just do the quick summary.
Yep.
And go ahead.
We have a quick question about how to optimize the relationship, and also if we do you flatten your model or leave it normalized? And I think you answered the normalization piece earlier.
Definitely, if flatten, you mean do I just import a single massive table? No. Just like in a database, it's best to have fact and dimension tables. Same thing in Power BI. You want your numbers and dates on a data table, and you want your keys and text separately on dimension tables. That will drastically reduce the footprint of the model size, and it's relationships are where Power BI gets a lot of its power in terms of calculations. It's very quick to be able to traverse relationships in the model or propagate relationships, and you want those separate tables. At a minimum, you want a data table and a calendar table. If nothing else, if you only imported 1 additional table, you should absolutely have a dedicated calendar table to do any time intelligence functions. I have helped so many people commonly where they're just using the sales date on their date table, and they're hitting all sorts of issues with time transformations or date transformations because they're using this column that has non-contiguous dates where there's gaps in it, and they don't have a dedicated calendar table, which would solve 99% of their problems.
Okay, great. And then we also have a question on how much data can I import into using import mode in Power BI. If the data is going to grow big in the future, is it better to do a data model in Azure Analysis instead of Power BI?
Depends on how big you mean by big. And the model in Power BI is the same as the model in Azure Analysis Services. They're both the Vertipack engine. They are essentially the same in the backend. It just depends on what pro features are turned on. Azure Analysis Services or SQL Server Analysis Services will have the most amount of customizations. You can change page size and all of this. The roadmap is continuously blending the two together, so you will have more and more features available in Power BI, but in the backend, they're nearly identical. With Power BI Pro, Power BI Premium, you can have billions and tens of billions of rows in a Power BI import model that is sitting in the service that is just directly in Power BI. So there are still some use cases for Azure Analysis Services. I would say as the months and years go on, though, the need to have those dedicated entities over there are becoming less and less because they're continuously turning on, and enabling access to more of these, those kind of types of features, and especially in Power BI Premium for very large enterprise models. So it's kind of it depends between the two, but I wouldn't say that very often anymore. I build Azure Analysis Services models versus if they already have Premium, then most of the models I can just do directly in Power BI now, especially with a lot of the new advanced developer tools that are coming out to allow you to develop with Power BI Desktop.
Nice. And thank you, Ed, for your response on the 48 times a day. We also posted the comparison. Yep.
Yeah.
And then we've got, is there a performance impact on the order of the steps, like converting to INT first versus last?
And I think part of that was to the idea that, like filtering and removing columns is good to have first. The other thing that we'll talk about in a second, so this will be a nice segue, is query folding. That's one thing that you want to keep the query folding happening for as many steps as possible, because anything that once it breaks, then transformation gets slower and slower. But I'll use that to actually segue into the next section, and that actually talks about ordering and everything, and just the concept of query folding. So this will be a nice way to wrap up the video. That's the last thing we'll discuss for today before wrapping up query folding. Because these will be an available PDF, I'm going to switch and kind of breeze through them a little bit and then more focus on the demo. But I just want to kind of briefly summarize what query folding is. So essentially, this is when Power Query can take all of your transformations that you've done in the UI, and it writes a SQL script or a script for whatever source you're connected to that's being folded to, and it takes that and says, hey, here is a view, or whatever that system calls it, run this, and then return back to Power BI the transformed data. So it's not doing it in memory, it's asking the data source or the database to do it for you. It will very commonly be significantly faster than having to import the data and do it itself, like by factors of either easily 5-10x faster. And query folding can happen for either the entire query or part of it, which is the idea that I alluded to. If you have 15 steps, if you can have 12 out of 15 that are folding versus 4 out of 15, that's going to mean it's faster because more and more transformations are being handled at the database side, not the Power BI model side. Most of quite a few data sources in Power BI have the concept of that, especially with relational databases, OData feeds as well. Things that just are not supported are any of these flat files, in terms of web blob. One thing I'll mention here is data flows. So data flows with Power BI Pro stores your data in flat files. So it's blob storage. For data flows for Power BI Premium, however, with the advanced compute engine turned on, it will store it in a Azure SQL database for you. That can be folded against. So, just as kind of an FYI, for one nice thing about Premium is you can actually have query folding against data flows in Premium, just not in Pro. All right. Again, I'll just kind of briefly mention these, but a few of my fan favorites that are in here is pivoting and unpivoting. It's a pretty common one. That's the one you kind of see down here at the end. I love the fact that this can be folded, but you can just see through this list a long series of common transformations, and even more than this nowadays, that can be folded. So a lot of it is really you try a step. If that breaks, well, okay, is there any other way to do this same transformation? If I duplicate and rename versus split the column, okay, well, it does one fold and the other does not. And sometimes it's a matter of like you don't always know, and it depends on how the engine is handling it. But it's a bit of trial and error, and the goal is just to try to see what's being folded. Things that typically cannot. The only one that I'm going to mention here, just for sake of time, is number one thing that you should avoid as a pitfall. Never, ever, and I'm going to say ever, 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 literally just, I'll continue to say the word ever a few more times. Do not use a custom SQL statement pasted directly in Power BI. You can do that, and the only possible reason you should need to do this is if you are locked out of the database and you have no way of working with IT and ever getting a view created. But the reason for this is if you connect to SQL and then paste in that little custom SQL script box a custom SQL statement, nothing will ever get folded back to the database. That has now completely broken it, and it is now behind basically a brick wall, and it is going to have to do all additional transformations on top of this in memory. So I would call that just a straight up, it's a bad practice to do because it limits you on any potential to fold. If you take that same statement, create a view in the database, and then just connect to that view, same SQL statement, but now let's say you do additional transformations on top of it in Power Query. It basically takes that view, writes a SQL script and says, select from this view and then, do all these other transformations. And the database will still process that for you. So that is a big no-no that people don't understand, but 100% will kill performance if you use custom SQL statements pasted directly in Power BI. All right. Easiest way to see query folding and occurring is if you right-click at any step and you see the view native query. There are some rare exceptions to where this isn't the case, but it's very reliable to tell you that query folding is happening. This will be essentially not grayed out, and if you click it, what you'll get is a window that pops up that just shows you the script that is being generated and spat to the database where, hey, this is the query folding that's occurring in there. So it writes the script for you, and you can't edit it. It's something that's just displaying what's going to be ran, but it's a way for you to check to see if folding is still happening and being handed back to the server side. All right, let's go ahead and do a quick demo. I'm going to use this one. Come on. Just letting it connect to Azure at the moment. Try to do one more. I think I know what it is. Nope, it's not my VPN. Okay, there we go. Perfect.
Nice.
Yeah, it's always one of those like, oh, it's a gremlin. It's not sure what's causing it, but you can take a look. Check out all these transformations that I've done. I basically just have an online database in Azure, and that's hosting all my stuff. I have merged with another table. I've inserted a new column. I've removed rows. I've even applied a relative date filter in here. So, I actually went to the date column in this case. Where is it? Here we go. And this is an actual relative date. So meaning it will contain a rolling window that will always keep the last 15 years of data. So, in the previous 15. So all these things, changing types, lowercase, tons of transformations that I've done. I've even grouped rows and summarized it up to a higher level of granularity. All this stuff, which then converts to a SQL script that is being passed out. Like, this would have taken me a hot minute to write if I had to go in. Like, I can write SQL. I wouldn't really want to have to write this entire view myself. That's a lot of work, and it is generating this for me. Even the sense of this right here. This is a fixed statement in the query right now of when the relative date needs to be. But every day that this refreshes, this automatically changes the values based off of the transformation that I've done. So it will edit and send a new script back to the database each time it passes this through. So it's written a pretty complex statement as far as the joins and everything else, and that is what is being ran as a view at the server side and then being handed to Power BI. So great way to basically get really fast performance for this stuff. And these are the situations where, as you go through these steps, you want to, each time you do a new step, check. Oh wait, okay, that broke my my query folding. Well, okay, well this thing grouped rows, that reduced granularity. Maybe if I did remove duplicates instead, or there are times where in Power Query you have more than one command or function to accomplish the transformation that you want. And if one breaks it, delete that one, try a different one. Because sometimes and it's not always clear because the engine does a lot of complex things, why one works and the other doesn't. But as long as you can keep that ball like kicking down the road, it will mean your performances are going to be faster and faster. And if you notice that a step breaks something, then what you want to do is you want to make sure that that step is one of the last things that you do in your list. That should not be step number one unless you have to have it there. Just any step that breaks stuff, kick it to the very end of your list as much as is feasibly possible given your transformations. But it's a very useful concept, and it will guarantee it against any data source that supports it. And there's Microsoft white paper documentation on this. You want to continuously do those sanity checks and make sure that it's working appropriately. Like I said, there's a few other things that I can cover, but we're getting close to time, and I want to allow us a little bit of time for questions, and then give a bit of resources and notes here at the end as well.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that content. Let's just see here. Here we go. We have our next question. Could you please show the left join? And also, would you suggest combining multiple fact tables into one?
So the left join itself, I'll quickly show that, but that's just an option up in the upper right-hand corner. With anytime you're doing any query, you have an option to merge queries, and then you can choose the join type. So that's a pretty straightforward thing. You have left outer, right outer, inner, etc. So all of the standard joins in SQL are available in here, and it's really just picking the table and then selecting the same two columns to bring it in. So fairly straightforward for that. Whether or not to combine multiple fact tables, that really depends. Like, is this a situation where your fact tables are essentially the same, other than like, it's sales data for the US versus the UK, but all the columns are the same. The data structure is identical, except that they just happen to be kept in two different sources. Sure, you can combine that into a master fact table, but typically, like, unioning is something that I don't do too often, and if they share all the same relationships, you can keep them separate. The primary driving factor should really be, do I need to combine them because I need a single column for sales or a single column for budget that needs to be summed together? And I don't want to have to add two measures from two different columns to do that. I would rather just say sum the sales column. So it's going to largely depend on the structure of your model and your business requirements, but sometimes you do want to combine them and sometimes you don't. So it's the consultant answer if it depends.
Awesome. And then we have requerying folding custom SQL statement. Is it the same with custom Custo/Azure Explorer statements?
I've never. So what was the? I know Azure Explorer, at least as a concept. What was the first one? Cujo? Yeah. What was the first data source that they said?
Custom SQL statement. Requerying. I'll just read the whole thing. Selena's asking, requerying folding custom SQL statement. Is it the same with custom Custo Azure Explorer statements?
I'm not connected to those in quite a while, so I do not know if they're currently on the list of query folding, but Microsoft maintains a current list of anything that allows for that. So if your data source is on the list, then it's essentially identical. What it will do for each source is, they've basically written a Rosetta Stone. So Power Query has M, and whatever data source that exists out there, they have the somebody's coded translations where if you do this step, it will then be translated as the code that will then be accepted by the source it's connecting to. So it's not just always writing SQL statements; it will write against whatever is needed by that source. And if either of those that you just mentioned are available in that list, then it would be writing and doing essentially the same thing. It's writing a script that will then be accepted and then processed by your server-side source. Let's do one more question, and then I'll throw up a couple links and everything.
Okay, excellent. Why not just write a view and leverage that for query folding instead of manually and in brackets, in parentheses, tediously creating applied steps?
And see, I would offer the counterpoint of that is I started 7-8 years ago as a database developer, but I don't touch SQL that often. So I could do in Power Query that thing in 5 minutes. Writing that entire script that I just showed you probably would have taken me, half an hour or so potentially to do that in SQL. So it's where you're comfortable. If you really want to do all of your work in SQL, you can do that. Just do, write all the views that you need to, but sometimes you don't have access to the database. As a consultant, very often I have to work with IT to do that, and that might be 3 to 5 days for me to go from development to production and all these other things. So Power Query generates it immediately for you, and if you're good and comfortable with it, especially against multiple data sources, you only have to learn one tool, that can now fold against SQL. It can fold, against Oracle, OData feeds, all these other things. So you only have to learn one language. It automatically translates your language to all these other sources for you. So I think it has a much greater universal application versus just having to write SQL, at least for a consultant perspective. But neither of them are wrong. They're both going to run well. It's this just gives people who aren't SQL experts or database experts the ability to use a user interface and have the script written for them. So like that's what makes it a lot easier, is you don't have to code to write this. You have to code to write SQL.
And we do have 2 more questions. How would you handle business user defined mixed type columns, i.e. revenue field shows both N like November / M like Mary string and 100,000 integer? Would you try to split the column or use PQ's data type any capability?
So if you have any column that has information displayed like that, you'll need to figure out a logic to convert it. If you have anything that's going to have data that needs to be summed, it's going to have to be a number. You can't have it as mixed with anything else that's formatted or anything. So you could potentially split it. Otherwise, you're going to have to figure out what's the pattern, and then use that pattern to then identify through a conditional column or something a way to convert it so it does show up as number. If I was understanding the question correctly, but anything that is aggregated will need to be whole number, decimal number, or fixed decimal. I'll answer the last question, but I just want to mention what's in front of us here. And just to confirm with you, Kelly, can I, for the presentation PDF link, that top link, can that also go into the description of the video just so they have access to the PDF?
Sure, absolutely. And I think we should also copy and paste them in the chat window here for folks to have them as well.
Cool. Yeah. So all these links here will be available for you in the chat window, also in the description of the YouTube video. But the top link is all the presentations that I do. The PDFs will be available there, so you'll have access to all of those notes and additional references that I provided. Both my consulting services and templates, files and templates link are on here. So I actually produce a lot of files and kind of plug and play things for people. One thing that I like to do for anybody that's attending these is, as a kind of a thank you for taking time out of your day. You get a discount code for anything on my website, 30% off that lasts for 30 days. So that will be available to you. If you like the content, I would recommend checking out my YouTube channel. I also do a video every Tuesday on everything related to Power BI and the service. Lots of fun little tips and tricks and just cool techniques. And then feel free to also reach out to me as well, just on my LinkedIn page. That's going to have a lot of really good content as well from articles. And then it's just a great way to get a hold of me and ask questions. But yeah, so last thing that I'll just put up here, if you want, this is a QR code, just takes you to a website. And what this does is it either put your name basically into a hat to win an hour of consulting from me. You can pick my brain on anything related to Power BI. The exchange that I have is it basically just signs you up for my blog. If you're a subscriber already, it just puts your name in the hat. But it's something you can cancel if you want to. But it's just a great way to, if you want some Power BI help, you get a chance to win one of those with me. And then I think you said there was one more question.
Yeah, let me just grab that here. Here we go. Will the chat window remain after this meeting? I don't believe so. We do have some great feedback on the presentation as well, and I think they are all. I thought there was one more, but I don't believe so. Oh, can you explain what is query folding or provide a demo example? And I think we did that.
That was an old question.
Yeah, that was an older one. Yeah, I think we did that. And that's pretty much it. Oh, hang on, one more just came in. Is select from table considered a custom SQL statement?
Yes, as long as there is any script in that little SQL statement box, the optional one when you connect to a source, it doesn't matter what it is. As long as you typed any statement period in there, that is a custom SQL statement, and that will no longer accept query folding. You have to use the navigation and actually navigate to a table or a view from the tree structure for it to allow for query folding. Nothing in that box will ever support it. I don't know if that's going to change in the future, but I'm fairly certain it won't.
Nice. Okay. Also, I put in a link for our short survey, and I love that you have your QR code there, by the way. So feel free. It's great. It's great. I love QR codes. So yeah, please consider filling out our short survey. Are there any other questions? I don't see any others. Thanks, Scott. Scott said thanks for the info. Thanks to all who joined. I think we are right at time right now. Please look out for the Power BI YouTube channel post of this video, along with some links. And we look forward to you joining our next webinar series. And Reed Havens from Havens Consulting, great job. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me, and for everybody still on the call, thank you for attending and taking time out of your morning, afternoon, evening, or night.
And Reed, do we have any links to post in the chat window as well, or have we done that? I can, if you want to send them over to me, we can pop those in the chat window while folks are still on the call. And while waiting for those links, you can use the survey link above that I just posted to
see how well this works. I mean, it's in there. It's a little wrapped, but these are all of the links that I just had from the slide, and it looks like they can be clicked. So
nice.
Just keep that up. Okay.
Got those? Yeah.
Anything else?
I think we're good to go. So we've got those links. You sent those to me here. I'm just trying to post. So I'm just copying those right now.
Okay, perfect.
One section. Here we go. Got those. And here we go. I'm learning to be better at copy and paste. Okay, I think these are the ones here, online resources. Okay, folks, those links are now posted as well.
Perfect.
And thank you everyone for filling in that survey. We really appreciate your responses.